first owl in outer space. In 1962, they put an owl into outer space, after the dogs, before the woman. Nobody knows this because, like all really interesting government operations, it has been kept secret. The owl didn't want to go. No animal anyone has ever cleverly sent into outer space or anywhere else has ever had a choice. It just didn't matter as much as humans, so into the capsule they went, to death or dementia. This particular owl was taken from the Siberian tundra. She was out hunting for her family, when all of a sudden she was caught up in a net that lay hidden in the snow. She lay still, as her mother had taught her to do in such situations, and remained calm as big men in big snowsuits came to collect her and put her in the back of a truck in a cage with a blanket over it. What difference this was supposed to make to her she didn't know. When they removed the blanket, she was in a brightly lit white room. She turned her head this way, then that way. She blinked her big yellow eyes. As a man approached her cage, she arranged her feathers and took a deep breath. He opened the door. She stayed still. He reached inside with leather gloves and put both his hands around her body. She stayed still. He turned and said something to his colleagues. She couldn't understand, of course, as she did not speak any human language with fluency, only vague imitations when it suited her. She couldn't understand his words, but she could understand body language. He was happy with her compliance and proud of himself that he could handle her in this way. Pride is easy to read. And then he turned his head to her, and something on his face looked like flattery, a smile, a patronizing softness to the eyes. He nodded to his colleague, and back into the cage she went with a piece of raw fowl, which she poked, sniffed, and kicked to the side. Over the next little while, she didn't know how long, for she was kept inside and did not understand time in the way her human handlers did, by consulting things called clocks and alarms and calendars. It looked to her an obsessive job. She was trained. 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 At the end of these sessions, she still didn't know what that meant. They indicated for her to do something, and she did it. This is trained. Not knowledge. Training. She did learn a few things, though. She learned, for instance, that if a human with a glove on held up a piece of flesh, and she flew over, landed, and ate a little of that flesh, they would be most pleased. That this may be the accomplishment of the day. With this, she learned that humans are keen on being busy. The busyness is the accomplishment. Her instinct in these situations, as one may imagine, was to fight, to flap her gigantic wings furiously and go for the soft parts of the face, to dig into the soft heads of her captors with her claws. This was her instinct. But there's something people forget when dealing with creatures. They always forget. In all animal life, and human life too, there is not only instinct but strategy. Every day, every vertebrate species uses both of these, more or less, depending upon the situation. Humans take it for granted that they use both. Sometimes they give credit to wolves or to orcas, rarely to birds. Bird brain, size of a penny. Bird brain, bird brain, bird brain. This bird brain that had survived millions of years. This penny that, when given its rightful, natural choice, works quite well. This bright little penny. So while her brain was not as complex, a word she heard over and over again and understood it to mean important, as a primate's, her senses, particularly those of sight and hearing, were a certain kind of intelligence that might translate to something like intellect. She could hear, for instance, the difference in people's voices, what inflections showed up in their speech, and what that indicated about what kind of person they were, whether they would punish her for a naughty flap of the wings or laugh. She could hear pride, She could hear sorrow and jealousy and happiness and sweetness and kindness and cruelty. Can't we all? She could see the little muscles on the face of her captors, little muscles most humans couldn't see, the twinge of regret in the eyebrow, the clench of disgust where the jaw hinged, the flicker of fear in the eyelash. All such tiny movements, and put together with all of the other movements of the face, all of the other movements everywhere in the body, and the bodies around those bodies, and the room with the clocks and alarms and calendars, one could easily miss them. But not the owl. This was her job. This was her life. Spotting things nobody else could spot. And in the moment of the hunt, when killing is critical to survival, that is what one does. Otherwise, one may soar over the fields and forests without striking, looking, and listening for the change. Human brains and bird brains do have one thing in common. That reptilian side has never quite been bred out. The eat or be eaten ethos, the very basic, the most basic, in fact, the most base, simplistic, elemental instinct of survival, at any cost. Why else put people or animals or anything into a tin rocket and blast it off into the unknown? Survival. And fear. Fear that this planet may one day not be enough, in fact is not enough today. A conquering arrogance, yes. Yes, of course. Yes, indeed. Yes, always. But maybe one fed by fear. And she understood fear, this owl. She understood, as an apex predator, what it was to instill fear into something smaller than she. She knew what it was to take a life, to swoop down upon a mouse as it tried to scurry back to shelter. She knew what it was to kill it, to crush it in her beak and swallow it down whole, bones and all. She knew what it was like to bring meat home for her family, so that they too could survive. She knew her purpose and she knew fear, but she wasn't ruled by it. The mouse in the field wasn't ruled by it either. Everyone knew the rules of engagement and their role within it. But these people. Often the room was so thick with fear she could smell it, the sickly fear sweat. Everything they did was done with a kind of harried fear, fear of failure, fear of the unknown, fear of falling. The owl didn't know these fears, and during these times of overwhelming chaos, she kept to the back of the cage, did not make it easy for the gloved hand to bring her out. Everything quick and disordered and ugly. Chaos. This feeling was no good, and she didn't understand why they used it so much. It created nothing, it facilitated nothing. Chaos and fear are only destructive. If she spent her days this way, she never would have made it past the first few months of life, distracted and distracting. So she tried to ignore these things, so cloudy and loud. When they were ready, they fitted her with a little suit and a helmet. This also pleased them, as they tapped on her visor, grinning and laughing. She closed her eyes. They closed the hatch. She waited in the silence of the capsule, watching the lights on the dashboard, feeling the heat from below. She heard the numbers, and then they blasted off. Just her and the little tin shuttle hurtling off into space. She was grateful for the helmet. The amount of noise she was hearing with it on was almost too much. She surely would have died if she'd had to hear it at full volume. She was grateful for the suit, too. As the shuttle broke the sound barrier and went into orbit, things got pretty warm. All this sound, all this fury, all of these blinding lights, and then nothing. A slow dance through stars and black. She made her way over to a window, popped off her helmet with her beak, and floated there, looking outward. The radio crackled something. She turned her head to it, then back to the window. She looked out into the cosmos. She felt neither fear nor awe. She'd been up in the sky before, without the benefit of a tin can. The radio crackled again, some kind of panicked shouting. This didn't mean a thing to her. She wriggled out of the suit and spread her wings, shaking her body to loosen it of these constraints she'd been under these many days and nights. She heard a crack and a crackle then. The radio shouting got louder. It appeared the shuttle was breaking apart, She turned her head this way, then that way. She blinked her big yellow eyes, and when the crack became large enough, she flew out of it, as birds do. People don't like to recount failures, and governments hate it even more. So they didn't. They didn't talk much about the shuttle that never returned to Earth, nor the creature they sent up with it. They didn't talk about how they sent up the satellite to find the wreckage. There was a little spacesuit and a helmet lodged into the nose, but no owl. So they never mentioned the owl. And when anyone who had anything to do with her did think of it, they just assumed she died quickly in the accident, dissolved somehow, with no trace. And pretty soon another expedition was started, another great exploration for humankind, with an actual human this time. And everyone else dissolved into history, floating out there with the wreckage of failure.